Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT ranked meta video. Today is our final video on set 6 as we take a look back on the ranked meta for the whole set. The talking points for today are augments, items, pace of the game, the late game, and a small bit of time spent on the meta compositions and champions. While this is a recap, at the same time consider this a review for the whole set. Let's not spend too much time on this intro and just jump right in with augments. We've talked many times throughout set 6 about augments and their design. Let's just sum it up with one quick question. Were augments successful? Well, there's a lot of nuance to answering this question, but to keep it simple, the definitive answer is yes. Augments are interesting and make the game a lot more fun. Was the implementation of augments perfect in set 6? Not at all, but why is that? For the most part, augments suffered a lot from balance. There was always going to be an issue because it's such an extensive new system being added to the game. Something like well over 100 augments were said to be in the game at the launch of the set, and that stayed roughly the same the whole time. With so many augments and each player having 9 options a game, this creates a ton of variance, and variance is difficult to balance well. Thus, the main criticism for augments is the balance issues that plague the system for all of the set. That said, they did begin to nail it near the end with the final few balance patches, adding a lot of healthy limitations to the augment system. And in set 7, we're seeing those limitations push further into the balance of the augments as well as a few other key designs. Point is, augments were always going to be rough in set 6 because they needed a lot of time to work out the balance. As for augments' influence on the overall meta, well, they definitely played a role in the meta, and depending on the patch, some augments were clearly better than others. But in general, augments kind of took a back seat as time went on and players figured out that there actually wasn't a lot of choice in regards to augments. Most of the time the choice was obvious, though the 1-4 augment certainly had the most wiggle room. The flowchart of options was basically to take a combat augment, something useful for your comp, and then something specific to your composition. Power in general trumped creativity, and econ augments really only mattered in the early game except for when the balance was out of whack. Early on in the set, there was a lot more choices since the augment meta wasn't figured out yet, but later on, there became fewer and fewer choices. This isn't entirely the fault of the augment system, it's just a natural progression of competitive play to aim for the best option. That said, balance also contributed to the issue by limiting viable options. Why take X augment when Y augment is clearly stronger? And again, this criticism isn't meant to say augments are bad, just flawed in set 6 due to balance. Honestly, we could easily keep this discussion going, but let's wrap up by saying augments are one of the best mechanics they've added to TFT since the game came out. While the system has had issues, once they get the formula correct, it should be a healthy and fun full addition to the game that hopefully stays in beyond set 7. Let's shift over to another point of criticism for set 6, and that's the design of the mid-set Neon Knights. Sometimes the mid-set shakes up the game or adds new elements to the meta that make it more interesting. Or in some cases like set 5, it introduces a better mechanic. For set 6, Neon Knights actually took a step back in design. The champions and synergies they added were, well, a bit uninspired and simple, and had quite a few reprints from previous sets. The easiest example of why Neon Knights felt less interesting than Gizmos and Gadgets is Sivir. Sivir was a 4-cost range champion with 2 synergies that boosted her stats and an ability that not only gave her a form of AoE, but also an attack speed boost. That's a really overloaded kit for a ranged carry, and they didn't introduce any real counterplay for her. Yone is the most comparable carry from the first half of the set, and even though Yone always stayed relevant for almost half of the set, he still had limitations being a melee carry. Overall, the mid-set for set 6 didn't add much to the meta. If anything, it felt like options were being taken away, like the loss of Urgot or several assassin carries, as well as a few low-cost options. We ended up seeing mostly Sivir and Innovators do well every patch with a sprinkling of other consistent options. Does that mean Neon Knights was bad? Not necessarily, more so that it was just less interesting than the design of Gizmos and Gadgets. Comparing the two halves of the set, the first half will definitely be far more memorable when looking back on set 6 as a whole. Now that we've covered a few of the criticisms of the design aspects of the set, let's talk about the meta-specific things, beginning with items. We'll be frank, items didn't feel all that interesting throughout all of set 6. Usually the best components were figured out quickly based on the patch meta, but in general there ended up being a lack of item diversity. Auto attack carries in particular got pigeonholed into requiring Last Whisper across both halves of the set. AP carries always had a few options, with Jeweled Gauntlet and Infinity Edge being usually best in slot. Component drop rate was actually fairly healthy for this set thanks in part to augments. The early and mid game felt less like players got behind simply because of item drop variance. Of course it still existed, but far less than previous sets. While certain items were a necessity, it didn't feel impossible on average to get the items you needed. And maybe that's the role items need to have. Instead of being a huge spike in power that defines your carry and composition, instead having them more as a helpful boost. On all, the item meta for set 6 wasn't too interesting because there wasn't much variance in items. Every champion role had a few specific items that did well, and that never really changed. The key item for the whole set was definitely Last Whisper, as practically every non-AP carry could use it effectively, and it was often a necessity. Next, let's briefly cover the meta compositions and champions, since we've already had 2 videos discussing them. Basically, the meta for each half of the set was defined by a few specific comps. Augments did add a bit of diversity, but surprisingly didn't play a large of a role as expected. If anything, they just made those dominant compositions and champions stronger. Top meta compositions across both sets were Innovators, Arcanists, Chemtech, and Mutant. Challengers were the definitive compositions of Gizmos and Gadgets, while Sivir Carry dominated Neon Knights. A lot of the meta across both halves of the set was focused on 4-cost carries. We definitely saw times where low-cost units did well or legendary-focused metas, but in general, the average meta was basically find a 4-cost carry and build a board around them. Part of that was due to the carries themselves, but also the flexibility of certain champions. Sion, Braum, Orianna, Seraphine, Janna, Yuumi, Silco, and a handful of other units were easy to flex onto multiple boards. Splash champions and traits of this set were definitely a highlight, though it did make a lot of the metas feel a bit homogenous. Pick a carry, toss in a Braum, sprinkle in some utility, and you're good to go. That was the formula for most boards that weren't specific, like Challengers or Sivir. The weakest aspect of set 6 for the meta was definitely the low-cost champions. Oh sure, a few of them were standouts for being item holders or even reroll boards like Twitch. But overall, not many 1-cost champions stood out as being all that essential. Use a few of them, dump them later. 2-cost champions did slightly better, but that was mostly due to flash in the pan reroll boards like Katarina, Warwick, Talon, and Kog'Maw. 3-cost champions also suffered a lot, with the second half of the set being mostly devoid of any real standouts, with only a few exceptions. Across both sets, there was Malzahar, Vex, and Echo as the ones that remained relevant. Of those 3, Echo was definitely the best all-around 3-cost, but Echo was just a utility splash champion. Point being, 3-cost units were a bit lacking in the power category. Shaco stood out the most in Gizmos and Gadgets, while Neon Knights, it may go to Lucian. We'll touch on 5-cost later, but as far as low-cost champions for set 6, they all felt quite limited. That meant the meta almost always focused on a 4-cost carry, which leads us to our next section, pace of the game. The pace of the game, or the tempo, basically means how quickly players are putting together their boards and stabilizing. The earlier this happens, the faster the tempo, and anyone not hitting the same tempo gets punished by other players hitting their power spikes. While not every patch had the same tempo, the pace for set 6 was almost always focused towards level 7 and 8 with 4-cost champions. As we said earlier, 4-cost champions were just better in a lot of ways than low-cost units. That means you wanted to hit level 7 and 8 to have better odds at finding those units. So the tempo was usually build your econ in stage 2 and 3 and then roll sometime in stage 4. There are exceptions, of course, like when specific reroll boards were doing well, but without any stable 2 and 3 cost carries, the meta always ended up back in that 7-8 sweet spot. Pace of the game did slow down a few times when legendary boards were a thing, but we'll touch on that point soon. On all, the pace of set 6 was definitely standardized towards 4-cost champion boards, and that did make each patch feel a bit samey. Augments helped break up that monotony in various ways, but only a few times did Augments really shake up the meta enough to change the pace of the game. Our final section of the set 6 meta is the late game. Where to begin with the late game? Well, for starters, with a lot of the meta revolving around 4-cost boards, it meant that the late game never felt much further than early in stage 6. Most of the game was decided before then, so it mainly came down to stabilizing boards and occasionally going to level 9. Level 9 definitely felt more doable in set 6 compared to the previous set, even though the cost was roughly the same. That is mostly due to augments, as there were quite a few augments that either made leveling faster, cheaper, or just gave players a boatload of gold to work with. Were the 5-cost champions worth it at level 9? The broad answer is yes. Most of the 5-costs had relevance in the meta one way or another, and quite a few of them were great splash champions. That said, besides a few specific metas, almost all the 5-cost champions didn't feel necessary to play. Jace is an exception because of innovators, but the other 5-costs could easily be left over. Tahm Kench was almost the antithesis to the 5-cost theme because you wanted him as early as possible and was less valuable the later you played him. Silco and Yuumi definitely played a key role as splash champions, but boards could go without them. Kai'Sa, Jinx, Akali, Zeri, and Victor were all carries, but usually needed to be level 2 to be effective. That meant some high rolling was necessary, or going to level 9. And then there's Galio, who for the most part felt like a failed design except when Clapio was playable. But that has more to do with Colossus than anything. I'm not saying the 5-cost champions were useless, just not all that essential to the overall meta of set 6. That meta was centered mostly around 4-cost boards with a few 5-costs sprinkled in. Sometimes legendary boards did well, and when 2-starred, quite a few of them became viable carries, but it wasn't necessary to do well. players could easily climb in ranked by playing a 4-cost carry every single game. Overall, less interesting late game doesn't mean Set 6 was a boring meta. The consistency of knowing what champions and boards did well was actually a blessing in gizmos and gadgets since the Augment meta wasn't entirely figured out. The end point is that when the pace of the game is centered so much around 4-cost boards, it makes the rest of the game less interesting and creates fewer options. Luckily, Augments added enough spice to make up for the bland aspects of the set. That's all for today's video, folks. Despite our criticism, Set 6 was definitely fun and successful. That success is largely due to the Augment system. If we took out the Augment system and only looked at the champion and trade design, well, Set 6 would probably be forgotten rather quickly. That's honestly okay because it meant players had time to focus on Augments and gave the dev team the information needed to improve that system. Which leads us towards Set 7, where Augments are looking to be in their best form yet. Maybe that means Set 6 was always meant to be a stepping stone, but at least it'll go down in TFT history as one of the more memorable sets thanks to the Augment system. Remember to check out the GiantSlayerTV socials in the description below to keep up to date with any news, shows, or other content. Thank you for watching. If you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future GiantSlayerTV videos.